Let's talk about coring out bowls and drying green wood. Now, I've got a nice big blank, a 14-inch blank here. This one's been cored out and hollowed out and ready, and it's dry. But I don't want to lose all this wood that was on the inside. This is a nice olive ash piece of wood. Olive is the color, it's a green ash is the species. So I want to get those moldable bowls out of there. That's what we're going to talk about today, and getting the outside shaped. When we core this, we're going to use a one-way coring system. We'll explain that system a little bit further on in the video. For now, let's start working on the outside of our blank. To do that, I'm going to use my screw center chuck. And I like to have as large of a faceplate as I can for this operation, so I'm going to use my 7-inch screw center chuck. If you're using the screw center that comes with your chuck, make sure you use your larger jaws as backers. Next, let's look at our blank. I've got a 14-inch by 5 to 6-inch thick piece here. As I look this blank over, I can see my growth rings here, so my heart center was here. As I look close, I've got a little crack coming off the pith right here. You can see my growth rings coming around. As I get to the bottom of this blank, it's almost all white. I'd like some color in the bottom as opposed to the top. Let's look at the other side of this. This one doesn't appear to have any cracks in it. So again, I'd rather have the color in the bottom. So I'm going to put the heart center on the bottom of the bowl, drill my hole on the outer part of the blank. Now, my blank was laid out with a compass, cut with the chainsaw, slabbed down both sides, laid out with a compass. However, when it was laid out with the compass, it was marked on the other side. I no longer have a center mark here. So I'm going to show you a way to find the center. Just for fun, I'll go ahead and put a mark in where I'm thinking is center. Looking through my glasses, my laser eye is probably off today. I'm going to take a tape measure. I'm 14 1/8, so 7 1/16. Fourteen and a half, 7 1/4. 14 and a half, 7 1/4. So I've intersected 3 times right there. That's where my center actually is, no matter where I put that initial mark. But I always try and put the initial mark and try and find that. The human eye tries to find center of objects, and so I try and encourage that and practice that by looking for that center. And the more you practice it, the better you get. And then I confirm it with a tape measure, or I could confirm it with a compass by taking a compass and holding it on the edge and scribing several arcs into the piece, or put my compass at center and go around the outside. But I have always liked just grab a ruler or a tape measure. I can find those typically easier than I can my compass in my shop. Now that I've got my center, I'm going to go ahead and drill that. My drill bit is sized for my screw. So I like to start these blanks with the lathe running. I'm under 200 RPMs, very slow speed. This blank has got some good weight, so I don't want to try and thread it onto the screw. I'd rather thread the screw into the blank, find center, and just let that blank take that, or let the lathe take the blank out of my hands. Then I'm going to lock my spindle lock and snug that blank up, bring my tailstock up. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the wood selection for the piece that we've got today. Green ash, we already talked about that. I've put the color in the bottom on this, so I've got some olive ash color. That'll show up best there in where the color's in the bottom. I've chose ash because it doesn't typically throw a lot of moisture out. It can be a little fibrous with the cutting knives and the coring system as we're doing that, and we'll see how that runs. Some woods are a little stringier. Some of your cottonwoods perhaps, or your poplars, your softer woods can be a little stringier. Moisture content is not really a big issue to these coring systems. I can core out a piece that's fresh cut today or a piece that's been drying for 30 years. The difference is going to be a drier piece will have a lot more dust and make a lot more noise typically than a piece that's got some moisture in it. I prefer to core out green wood for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lot funner to turn green wood, a lot easier to turn green wood, less dusty, but it also gives me a jump start on the drying process. If I tried to dry this piece of wood, 14 inches by 6 inches, I'm probably looking at 3 to 4 years, and chances of it drying without a crack are about 0, not in my environment. The old rule of thumb on a slab, had this been left as a big long slab or a plank, is 1 year per inch plus 1 year. So it's 6 inches thick, that's 7 years. I'm not that patient. That's one thing about wood turners is we don't have patience. We want instant gratification. So we're going to rough this blank out to speed up the drying process. I've got this mounted between centers. I'm good and secure. Let's bring in my tool rest. Now, I've got a piece that's relatively circular because it was cut on a bandsaw as opposed to being cut on just the corners knocked off with a chainsaw. And I'm somewhat parallel, so I should be able to get some speed going on here and work in a safe speed. But whatever area, if I had a piece, say this was a wedge cut piece, I'd want to take off the wedge first, or if I've got a bunch of out around corners, to get the out around corners out off of the blank as quick as I can. This should run fairly true, fairly good. We're going to start tool-wise. I'm going to start with my 1/2 inch bowl gouge with my standard fingernail grind on it. 50-degree nose, wings back about as far as the width of the flute to the diameter of the shaft. So 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch on this particular gouge. I've got my red line down the bottom of the flute. I shouldn't be able to see the red line through most of this bowl. I want that flute closed over, the red line, and then into the white line here on the handle, so it helps so that you can see visually what positions I'm holding things in. Speed, I'm going to start at minimum speed or 0 and bring it up. I'm going to feel for vibration. Passing through 500 RPMs, I'm getting a little vibration. There's 600 RPMs. So I'm just over 600 RPM, so when I do the math of the diameter times the RPM, diameter of the blank times the RPM of the lathe, should equal between 6,000 and 9,000. 600 RPMs times 14 inches in diameter is going to give me about 8,400. I don't need to be any faster than that. That's telling me what my rim speed is turning. My rim speed is turning around 30 miles an hour right now. I'm not turning very quick right there at the center, but out here I've got quite a bit of speed going on. So I don't need to increase the speed. That doesn't take into account the condition of your blank. Remember that. If you don't have a good sound blank, don't go with that formula and turn it up to the max speed or just because your lathe will handle it. Work safe, work sound. I had one small crack in this blank and I marked it out and we're going to get rid of it really quick. So I'm going to start left-handed on this piece. The handle's in my left hand and down on my left hip. My right hand is up on the rest. My flute's closed over, and my bottom wing enters into the cut. Slow down as I go out into space. If I continue to push through that where I go uneven, it'll start to bounce back at me and beat me up. I'm going to quickly check. I've made 2 cuts and I've already got an inch gap here on my tool rest, but I want to look and see already if I've got rid of that crack, and I have not. There's just a little bit of that crack left right there. I'm going to mark that in just a little bit deeper just for reference. Bring my tool rest in, bring my speed back up. Now also, I want to talk about the bevel. So I'm going to color my bevel in. Handle down again, flute slightly open, come in, pick up that cut. Now I can twist my wrist slightly, and I'm looking for the path of least resistance here. Now, one advantage to doing this left-handed is I'm out of the line of fire. One disadvantage is I don't see that shape. Also, while we're talking about that, if you look down on the cutting edge here, right behind the cutting edge, the ink is completely removed from that wing. That tells me I'm writing that bevel on the wing, not necessarily writing the bevel on the tip of the tool. I've got a little bit there. And since I'm not writing the bevel on the tip of the tool, that's going to leave me the ridges. Right now I'm just bulk removal of the wood, so I don't care about having the ridges. I'm just trying to get the wood I don't want in the blank onto the floor. As I make that entry and I'm getting quite a bit of bounce, I can come in, do smaller cuts, or put more weight forward with my right hand down into the tool rest. I don't push the tool into the wood, I push the tool into the rest. If I've got my right hand overhand, it also helps deflect shavings. And off into space. Now I kept pushing there and you saw how that just pushed my tool out of the way. Time to bring my rest in a little bit, double check that crack. It's completely gone now here where I've marked that. So that's looking good. I've eliminated that. That's not going to be in my bowl. We're going to have a real good success drying this bowl. So I'm going to continue to cut. Shape this piece of wood. You can hear from the sound I'm removing a lot of material with each cut, not just what you can see visually. Get a little bounce, slow down. I shift my weight to stay with the tool handle. I try and keep my hip on that tool handle as I go through that cut. Now I want to look up here on the rim and see if I've cut clean all the way around. Still got some bandsaw marks here. Go ahead and mark that really quick with my marker. And I want to start thinking about getting a tenon in on this bottom side. I'm going to switch to a right-handed cut, but the same cut, the shearing peel cut. Left hand anchors to the rest, flute slightly open, hips swivel. And the tool handle and the tool pivots into the wood. If you're getting a bunch of a large bounce, take smaller cuts. As I come further in, the handle has to come up to a level position. That's going to put me into a full-on scrape. I don't pull that back because I want to protect that edge as much as possible. I am going to come in, pick up my cut here. Bevel riding cut, and the bevel's pointing in towards the center, left hand down on the rest. And then, because I'm cutting right into end grain fibers, if I keep that flute closed, I'm splitting the wood and I get a louder tone than if I open the flute and cut off of almost a back cut. Stop just shy of my revolving center. And you can see I'm flat on there. I'd like to be just slightly concave. Flat will work. I think I'll take one more cut. Slightly concave that. Even though this is a green bowl, as it dries, it still needs to have a flat surface to sit on. I'll leave that nub in there for now from the revolving center, but I will remove that later. Let's start thinking about our tenon size. Now, I'm going to put a lot of stress on the tenon when I turn this piece around and it's in the chuck and I'm coring. I prefer not to have to use the revolving center for that. My way of getting around that is to upsize my chuck jaws. So instead of the 5-inch chuck jaws that we would normally use, I'm going to go to a 6-inch set of jaws. And on my jaws, I've closed them up and I've measured. My inside is between 124 and 130 mils is what I want to cut my tenon. I don't want these jaws open, because if I'm wide open, then I'm going to have 8 points biting down. I want to have that full circle, if possible, to bite down on.
Keep your head back.
I've divided my dimension in half, came from the center out, and then double checked it. And that line is about 126 millimeters, so that's right in the happy little spot where I want to be. I can be just slightly larger than that, but not by much. I'm going to come in, step in. Give this bowl some lift. When I say give it some lift, I'm taking some of that heavy weight out of the bottom. That'll help the drying process tremendously. If I've got a big flat bottom in this piece, it'll be tough to dry. I'm going to adjust my tool rest in a little bit here. Continue to step in closer on that pencil line I drew. Stopping about 1/8 of an inch away from that pencil line. Cutting a second step or a tenon in, if you'd like to call it that. Okay, still got my bandsaw mark here. I'm going to refine my curve. And when I do that, I'm going to come back and cut against the grain. I'm going to drop down in bowl gouge size. I'm going to drop to my one of my 3/8 gouges. Same grind, the fingernail grind. True that rim up. Flute's closed over. Now my red line's pointing at my tailstock. My bevel's pointing at my tailstock. And I'm going to make one refining pass to refine the curve. Now the advantage of this is I'm cutting against the grain, but I can see the shape develop on the horizon. Where I am cutting against the grain, there's a distinct possibility I'm not going to have a real clean surface. It'll lift some fibers out. But the trade-off for a good shape to me is well worth it. You also notice I started with my tool rest close and I'm ending far away. When I was going the other direction, I did the same thing. Start close and far away. Got a couple of ridges in it. That'll work for right now. Look, yeah, lifting a little fiber right there. Pluck some out right there. Should have done the same thing on this side. Couple of plucked out, a little fiber raised right there. Now that I've got my shape, now I can come back in and make one cut just under the surface. And I'm going the proper direction here. Nice bevel rubbing push cut. Now that I have the bulk out of the way and I've got a good curve. I don't like to have a tore up surface on my rough out blanks. I do like to have a clean cut surface for the main reason that it uses less sealer. And when I'm done and it's dry, I've got less to cut. If I've got a torn up surface that I've left from my roughing out process, once I've dried the piece and I go back to clean that surface up, I've got to go deeper than I thought. So a nice clean surface is desirable here. That'll help, like I say, the drying process and the returning process. Back to my marker line here. I'm cut clean where I had bandsaw marks, so I'm cut clean there. I'm cut clean through here. I'm not down to size yet and haven't developed my tenon. For developing my tenon, I'm going to come in with my spindle gouge. This is a 1/2 inch spindle gouge. 40-degree bevel, slice down that surface, close the flute, and scrape that shoulder. I've got a nice flat surface here for my chuck jaws to register. It's a little bit wider than my chuck jaws. That means I've got just a little bit of extra material in there. I don't need that extra 1/8 of an inch will slow down the drying process. Down here in the bottom, when I'm talking about the drying process, these fibers, the moisture right here in the center has a lot further to travel out than the moisture up on this rim. So I want to get rid of as much of this material as I can right now on this piece so that I don't have a chance of cracking later. If your rough outs are developing a crack along here with the grain and it angles in at about a 45-degree angle, that's a sign that you've left too much material down here in the bottoms. Now that I've got this cut, I'm going to pull the tailstock back and remove this nub. Just flatten that off. One last step is take my tailstock and bump it in and put a center point back on this piece so that once I've dried the piece, I know where center was. That'll give me a good place to start to true up as I go to true up the blank. Let's go ahead and get this piece out of the way. Now when I'm working in kind of a production mode, I'll normally do the back sides of 8 or 10 or 20 bowls so that I'm not repeating these steps here over and over again. And then I'll go back through and core out all those bowls that I've done the outside. So normally this blank would be set to the side in a plastic bag so that it doesn't lose any additional moisture. And I'll get big garbage sacks and line 4 or 5 blanks up into them, stack them all up nice, set them aside. Then once we get set up to do the coring, we'll go through and do all the coring. So let's put this one to the side right now. As we start to set up our coring system, using the one-way coring system, there's a couple of things we've got to do preliminary. You normally only need to do this one time, and that's set your height for your knives because you're not changing between machines. You set it up one time, and we're going to take you through all that setup. To start with, I'm going to set a revolving cone center in my headstock. I don't need to have it revolving, I just need a center point. Then we'll get our base. There's my base. And here's the knives we'll be using today. I've got the number 1 and the number 2 knives. And they've got the cutter on them. And the part that we need to adjust is this post right here. These are set, you set these for center height on your lathe. The combination between the one-way coring system and the Powermatic lathe, I find that these screws are just a touch too short. So the modification that I make for the screw there's no easy way to do this gracefully. But in each of these posts, there's a little riser block. And I've added my 2 cents worth to that riser block. And that is enough to raise that cutter to height and give me plenty of support on that screw. I'm going to start with my number 1 knife. Doesn't matter which knife you start with. I just had my number 1 was closest to reach. And as I bring that cutter in, adjust his clamp block just to loosely just so that that doesn't tip over and end up dropping onto my toe. But as I adjust this, I can easily see that my knife is below center. I need the tip of this cutter right there at center height. So in order to achieve that, I loosen up the hex nut, back up the stud, drop it into the hole, and check it. I'm still a little bit low. Back up the stud. Now, as I said, you only need to do this one time, typically, so take your time and get it right. I'm loosening the block, the clamp on my support knife. My dad always told me there's no point in being clumsy unless I could show it. So I'm dropping all kinds of stuff you can hear just off camera. So I'm going to adjust my support knife, and it's a good 1/8 of an inch low and underneath that primary knife, the cutting knife. So I need to go through the same setup on this. Loosen the nut, back that up about 1/8. Test. Could use maybe one turn. That's good. So now I've got the number 1 knives set for height. We'll move those to the side. And we'll repeat that step of centering the cutter for the number 2 knife. Your machine may not require a shim, and I would in fact say that most machines out there don't need to have an added shim. I do find with most of the Powermatic machines that is very handy to have a little bit of an extra shim in there. If you don't have pennies, use a flat washer. Let's go ahead and slide this out of the way for now. I've got my chuck with my 6-inch jaws. Mount that on there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm setting up an imaginary or a translucent bowl. This piece of wood represents the tenon that I cut and the shoulder that I cut on the blank that we're using today. This is about 3/8 long tenon, and then I've got about 1/2 inch here in the bottom. And there's my bowl blank. So as we're talking about this bowl blank, let's start thinking a little bit about how I want the path of this knife to come through. I'm 14 inches in diameter. I want to have my wall thickness 10% of my diameter, just roughly. So with this piece of ash, I need to be 1.25 to 1.5 inches thick, and I'm going to have 3/8 of an inch for my cutter to go through. Now the path that this takes through, remember I've got longer, as I come down the blank, I come into some long fibers. I've got some long fibers running through here. This wood in here is going to be the hardest to dry. I want to run that path of that cutter, and the blue line represents my cutter. I want to run that path right down and end about where this board, or where the bottom of this blank is. That'll leave me with 3/4 to an inch in the bottom. And I'm 1.25 inches at the rim. And that gets a little thinner. That will make that a lot easier to dry, this wood right here where those fibers are getting long. Now, our next bowl, I've got a smaller bowl. I'm going to need about 1 inch and about 3/8 for the cutter. My screw center went in about 1 inch. If I'd have used a face plate, I'd have screws out here, which means I'm going to get 3 bowls out of this if I used a face plate. But if I come in with my cutter here, since I've used a screw center, I'm going to get bowl number 4. 1, 2, 3, where am I drawn backwards? 3. That's bowl number 4. So I'm going to get, actually, I'll hollow this out. There's where I'm missing things. So bowl number 4 is never very big, but it adds a lot to a set. A lot of wood turners will tell me they don't want that smallest bowl in there because it's not worth anything. What do you do with that? To me, that doubles my money, because bowl number 1 has got value. That's your money bowl right there, that biggest bowl. Everything smaller, you lose value. But when you combine a set of 3 pieces, real pretty pieces of wood, you've now got a 3-piece decorator set. And that can sit on a counter or out on a shelf on display, where a large salad bowl may not be able to sit on display. So I've got a utilitarian piece and a display piece, because I've got that 4th bowl out of there. So that's one reason why I use that screw center. And I do keep hold of that little bowl. While I've got this set up, let's imagine I'm going to come in, set my knife up, and I want to come in and I want to find where that path is going to be. If I'm on that path right there, that's not right. So I'm going to set up my bottom depth first. There's my bottom depth right there. And I'm going to take and mark my bed. I can also take a measurement here. I've got my tool, my banjo, all the way up against the headstock. I can take a measurement here and set up a block that I can use. So that's where I typically set it. That's my block here. And then I can set up my start. Now as I run that knife through this blank, this would all be tightened up, secured. I'm going to come in and about this depth here, where the knife starts to pick up the thickness, I'm going to stop and bring my support knife in. Now this then becomes hidden as it goes down deeper. About the time where this gets thicker, it hits the end of that support knife, but that puts me over this post. It's time to move that support knife in a little bit further. Once I'm starting to get into this depth, I can start to have shavings bind up on me. And so I'm pulling the tool back and cleaning the shavings and coming around. Now as I come around, I'm also butting into end grain fibers. My shavings, as you'll see when we do core out the bowl, my shavings start to change. They go from ribbons to dust. And as I'm coming around through here, I'm hitting into all the end grain fiber until that comes in and it's ready to separate. The smaller knives are just repeats. So let's set this to the side. Go ahead and mount up our blank and get it ready to go. Oh, while we're here, let's also, what if your bowl's not this shape? Not all bowls are the same shape. What if I've got something large and shallow? My depth stop still works, and what changes is where I make my entry. So I'm going to set my entry over to here. And then I can bring that bowl out of there also. So depending on, you can adjust with this. I could still maybe even get a very small one out. If this is a real high-figured piece of exotic, it'd be worth getting a smaller piece out. Now the next thing let's talk about is getting this spacing. So I'm set here. It's actually running just a little bit different, and that will change from chuck to chuck. So you set yours up with your chuck. But I want to hit that face right there with my cutter. That sets my depth. I've got my blank here on there. Now I can make, that'll take my largest bowl out, but I'm going to start and take my smallest bowl out first. But as I put my number one knife in, you look, that pretty much follows that path that I initially drew and said I want to have that about right there. I didn't adjust anything to set up and start. Now let's adjust to this one. If I just adjust in and out, I'm going to hit the end of that stop, but I also, it drives me deep. Stay up against that block. That's not going to work. So I slide this out. I've got my longer side of my board, and that's an inch longer, and that's going to give me that core. So to refresh that, I start by picking up, at this point, my end cut. Then I add 1 and a little bit. The cutter's 3/8 of an inch. If I want to have an inch wide blank, I add 1 3/8 off of that. But by changing cutters, that automatically does that. And then from here, again, about 1 3/8 inches. And that's, my board is 1 3/8 longer on one side than the other one. And that's going to allow me to take 4 bowls out of that blank with 2 knives. I'm going to clear this out of the way. And I know a lot of you are asking right now, what are those measurements on that board? And that's fine, but remember that works with this machine because it's working with the distance and this chuck. It's working off the distance off the jaws to the shoulder on the spindle and whatever the spindle references to the banjo and wherever that is. But on this, if you've got this machine, this chuck, my long side is 8 and 3/16. My short side is 7.5. When I'm on a different machine, I make up a different set of boards. I've got my blank. I'm going to set my chuck so the chuck key's at top. My jaws are running vertical and horizontal, or at least the gap in my jaws are vertical and horizontal. And I'm going to take and line my grain up into that chuck to where it's running vertically. That way I'm compressing down evenly on bias grain on all four sides, rather than having a hard and a soft area. I'm trying to equalize that compression, and then I'm going to snug this up very securely. I don't want to have a large gap in here. I've got an 1/8 to a 3/16 inch gap on those jaws, and that tells me that I'm biting down very good and secure on that tenon. I've got a lot of hold on there. While if I'd have used a larger tenon, I might have more shoulder on there, but I wouldn't have as much biting power because I'd be into the 8 corners of the jaw rather than having that full circumference of the jaw. Our next step here is going to be to face off this surface. Since I've remounted the piece, I'm into a new chuck setting. Everything goes back to 0 or minimum. And then I'm going to bring the speed up, keeping one hand on the machine, feeling for vibration. There's my 600 RPM. Fluke closed over. Left hand on the rest. Shearing peel cut and just step in. Level that surface up. There's no point in leaving this surface uneven at this point. It's not a natural edge piece, and so if I leave it with a chainsaw mark, that's just going to add problems later on. As I cut the rim once it's dried and thinned down, that's just adding more work than I need. Starting from the center out, I'm slightly dragging that shearing peel cut. And I'm going to soften that edge. I don't want to leave that edge square because that'll give a place for a crack to start. By softening that edge, I've helped myself I gave myself better odds to drying this. I don't need what's in the center here any longer, and it'll be harder to get out of the way later. So I'm going to come in and open that center up a little bit. Get rid of that screw hole. I'm going to come in my thickness is roughly 10% of my diameter. There's my cutter. So I've got 4 bowls. This one, I don't care that the wall's a little heavy. I could open that up, but I don't care right now. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is I typically don't draw these out with a marker. I draw them out with a gouge. And that softens my edges. And that's how I lay out my bowls. So my tool rest comes out of the way. Ooh, still got saw marks right there. Again, there's no need. I'll take those out now. I'd rather have those out now than have to deal with them later. Thinking I've got a blank that's this deep and I've got a saw mark in it. I've got to take out when the wood's harder. Reaching in there with the heel on the gouge to feel if I got that removed, and then a visual check to confirm it. Got just a little bit of a sharp edge. Move my banjo out of the way. Start with the long measurement and the number 1 knife. Going to grab my number 1 support knife. Set that in here. Get it all of it lined up for that first bowl. Now before I start, I'm going to go ahead and change this cutter out. I don't know how many bowls I've cored out with it, but I know it's not as sharp as a fresh one. In order to help save my Allen wrenches, I'm going to take and pull some of that crud out of that head, or some of the crud out of the screw head. Once I remove a cutter, I take my marker and mark it red so I know it needs to be sharpened, and I'll set it to the side. I have both carbide and high-speed cutters. For the number 1 knife, I typically like to have a high-speed cutter. Now, in my bag of cutters here, my little box of cutters, I've got a rare earth magnet. The high-speed cutters attach more readily to the magnet than the carbide cutters do. So if I grab one that's stuck to the magnet, more than likely I've grabbed high speed. Now my number 1 cutter does not see the surface area of the number 2, so I prefer to put carbide cutters on the number 2 knives or the number 3s and 4s. The carbide definitely lasts much longer than the high speed, but they also, on these larger knives, they're seeing a lot more surface area. So we'll go ahead and change out this cutter also on the number 2. And looking at this one, that's a brand new cutter. I've yet to resharpen that. Comes stock with the high-speed cutters, and I like to have, as you can see here, several cutters so that every time I do change, I don't have to go back to the grinder to reset with new cutters all the time. Each time you buy a cutter, they come with a screw and a wrench. I'm getting quite a collection of wrenches because I hold on to those, and then the cutter. And the screws, it's good if you strip the heads out of those, or start to strip the heads out of the screws. Don't try and reuse those. They provide plenty of screws for you here. And these don't work in your sharpening jig. You've got to use the sharpening jig screws. Now, tightening that, I've got my long side of my Allen wrench down into the socket head, and that's all the tension that you usually need on these. You don't need to get the leverage and really push down on those. That'll cause you problems replacing those. Another note, as you're doing greenwood, and we're doing greenwood, it's not a good idea after you've been doing quite a bit and if you've got really wet wood, to leave these sitting, the screws sitting in there. Usually at the end of a session, I'll pull my cutters off, put those into my box that I keep my cutters to be sharpened in, and that way I don't get my screws rusted to the threads. So I've got new cutters on both of my knives. We're going back to the number 1 knife. I've got my my banjo up against my headstock. I've got my spacer block in here. Another note on the spacer block, it is a thinner piece of hardboard. I don't want to have a plywood piece that is as thick as the base plate here, because my support knife would hit that and it's in the way. So I like a thinner piece here, and I've glued a magnet on it so that it stays put on my lathe or my toolbox, wherever I set it to the side. So I've got a magnet on there. Line everything up. Now it's time to tighten this base down. One of the first things that I changed and modified when I got the system, they provide you with a 3/4 inch wrench, which is a good wrench on there, and it does the job. But I went to a ratchet to get my knuckles up off of everything a little bit so that I didn't bust my knuckles. Over a period of time, I have worn out the bolts and the washers that this system came with. And so if you look at mine, you look at it, and I've got several washers stacked here. I've got some, as I replaced the bolts, they were long, and so I had to shim it up in order to get that. And then I've gone again to the ratchet on here. There's also a magnet glued onto my base to keep my wrench in place. When you get the base unit, you also get one handle. I've added additional handles so that I can just grab and change cutters, and I don't have to change handles each and every time. Make certain that everything spins free and clear. And I've been sitting in this chuck for a while, so I'm just going to double check the tension on that chuck. Speed, somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of my turning speed that I was at. So my turning speed was at 600. I'm about 400 here. As I start my tool into the cut, I'm going to put a little downward pressure with my left hand, and then let my right hand bring in side pressure. My right hand doesn't push down or lift up, it just runs inward pressure. Now as my shavings start coming out, I'm coming out with some ribbons. Right now, as my shavings come out, they're coming out in ribbons. As I turn the corner, they'll start to come out more as dust, and you'll see when I start hitting that end grain fiber. Now as I'm running this in, I'm putting a little bit of pressure here with my right hand directly in to the blank, and if I feel it grab that cutter at all, if I feel the blank grab the cutter, that tells me it's time to move my support knife in. Now I'm in about this far, so I could still go a little bit in before I run the risk of bending the knife. But that risk is a very severe risk. I don't want to bend the knife. So I'm going to move my support knife cutter in. I turn the piece by hand, and I typically turn it in reverse before I start it up. Bring the cutter back in. Shavings started to bind up. So I'm going to have to stop and clean by pulling that cutter out as I advance forward. Bowl number 1, it's got a little olive color to it. As I make my movement here for bowl number 2, I loosen up my support knife first. I pull the shavings off the top, loosen up the base unit, turn my spacer, and then bring my cutter around. I'm still using the number 1 cutter here. Got that support knife in just a touch too close. Now, because I've moved that in that distance, this knife, and I've moved it out, this knife should take out a nice even thickness bowl out of this piece there. So this number 2 bowl, this core, will be a nice even blank. Feeling again for any grabbing. Right there, it's starting to want, I can feel the handle start to lift and it twists a little bit. So I'm going to stop, bring in my support knife. I go all the way to the back of the hole and then back up just a little bit. If you go all the way into the hole and then tighten this bracket, it'll cam over and lock your bowl in place. Then one of 2 things will happen. When you push the on switch, nothing will happen because you've got that jammed in tight enough. Or if you've jammed into the side of this bowl here, it can split this bowl in half. Watching those shavings, they're starting to bind up, so pull out. If you noticed right at first, it was slow to come out and then it popped out the bunch of shavings and then the cutter took off. And I just followed that until the shavings started to bind up. You see the shavings kind of changing. You see a little bit more debris coming out the sides and jumping up and down. The finer shavings. I'm no longer getting the ribbons. It all packs up on that knife. One more. Bowl number 2. Now another note here, and this runs true with all of the cutters. If I was to take and pull a square off of this cutter here, or off of the handle, that's about where my tip lines up. So I've got an idea by projecting in my mind a square or a right angle from this point as to how deep I'm traveling with that tool, the cutter tip at any given time. We'll set our number 2 knife to the side. I don't move the spacer block at this time. I'm going to loosen up the support bracket. Then loosen up the base. Grab my number 2 knife. And my number 2 support. And you hear that? You can really hear that torque on this knife now that we're out of ways. As soon as I start to round that corner, I lose some of that growl and that torque as it starts to come in a little bit. Bring in my support. Turn the piece by hand. Getting a pile of shavings there. Thought I had a catch. Or at least the lathe thought I had a catch. And that's because I've got the speed turned down. I'm running about 1/3 of the potentiometer on his point. I'm going to bring it up to 50%. That should give me my horsepower back. Stop and clean out those shavings. Keep those shavings cleaned out. They build resistance. Getting close to where I might need to be thinking about moving the support knife. Tuck that support knife up in. Gently feed the tool in there. I'm never jamming the tool against the wood. Gently feeding that in. I pull it out fairly quick to bring the shavings with it, but I don't try and jam it in. If you jam it in, that's where you'll get your catches. And if you've had catches, check your tenon, make sure everything's still sound in that chuck. Okay, I'm reaching over quite a bit. I started to feel that handle grab. Bring that support knife in. Turn by hand. Starts wobbling. That came out. It's got nice olive color to it. Bowl number 3, bowl number 4. Now as I take my calipers, you'll notice that right through here I'm a little thicker than I want to be. And I'd already taken some material off the backside. But because my curve of my cutter doesn't match the shape of my bowl exactly, I've picked up some thickness right here. I don't want that thickness in there. That'll make it harder to dry and possibly cause me a problem with the drying. So we're going to remove some of that wood. All this can be set to the side. I've got my tool rest set up. I'm going to reach over, grab my bowl gouge. First one to come to hand was my gouge with my traditional grind. It'll work just great for this. I could use my fingernail grind. It just didn't pop into my hand first. This one was more anxious to go to work. Flute pointed in the direction of cut, open to about 230, 2 to 230. Come in, take a good heavy bite where that's getting a little thick. 2 if necessary. That feels better. Check it with the calipers. I'm still just a little bit thicker than I'd like to be. We'll make another cut. My lathe speed is 600. Same thing that I shaped it at. The same speed I shaped it at. Much better. Liking that. One other advantage I get by taking that final cut is I'm going to leave a cleaner surface with my gouge than I ever would with my scrapers and my cutters going through on the coring systems. Now some of the questions that come to mind here. One, what if I don't want the smaller bowls? I could core this out as one big piece and go on with it. I'm still faster than turning this all into shavings in most cases by using the coring system to get this big knife, or this big bowl set. A lot of turners will sell these on to newer turners as a solid piece. I've got friends that do that. I rough them out and go with sets. Now, as we mentioned earlier, as a single piece, this has value. As a 3-piece set, this has value. As a 4-piece set, not as much value as splitting it up with the 3-piece and the 1-piece, because you decorate with odd numbers. 4 is an even number, so that doesn't decorate quite as well. So I don't want the 4-piece set typically. And where I really learned that lesson, years ago, I turned a 4-piece set as a wedding gift for my brother. And I'm going to get in trouble here. Nobody tell my brother about this. So I turned a 4-piece set for my brother. Gorgeous piece of gorgeous piece of figured olive ash. So it's olive ash, but had fiddleback running all the way through it. I took it upstairs, showed my wife. Says, this is for my brother. She looked at it, took the 3-piece set out, says, this is for your brother. They won't know that they didn't get this one. And I sold out the larger salad bowl on. So nobody tell my brother. I'll get in so much trouble here for that. So the 3-piece set has a lot of value. Gorgeous set. We want that. The single here, and that's why I go clear down to get that little bowl. Now what I would do with this from this point on, well, the other question is none of these have a tenon on them. So what do I do? Well, right now I'm not worried about that. These are green. They're going to move. So even if I put a tenon on them, it's not going to be a tenon later. It'll be oval. But it could be as simple as putting that in there, lining it up, and cutting a tenon. I'm not going to spend the time to do that because I know that'll go oval as it dries. So I'll set these I'll take these out now. I live in a very dry environment. I'm high desert, and so I need to do everything I can do to slow down the drying of wood. If I was down on the Gulf Coast, I've got to go the opposite direction. I've got to speed things up. I can't afford to speed things up. I don't need to. So what I would normally do with a piece like this is I'd take all 4 pieces, I'm going to take all 4 pieces here. I typically use a red marker because as my pieces get old, if they've been around the shop for a year or 2, especially if you're using the wax-based sealers, they get all dark and covered up and they're all black. Mold is black, so I use red because it doesn't look like mold. This is ash. It's a set of 1 of 4. A means it's the first set that I've cored today. Today is the 21st day of the month, and if you wanted to put a year on it, it's 21. I don't worry about what month it was so much. You could do that. I'm watching for movement as the pieces dry, and we'll explain that in a little bit. This is A21, and it is piece 2 of 4. A21, 3 of 4. A21, 4 of 4. That way I know when I look for this in the pile, I'm looking for a 4-bowl set. Now, even though I'm closer to July than I am to December, I've got my Christmas tree ready to go. That's a Woodturner's Christmas tree. So this will all get sprayed with water and then set back in plastic bags until tomorrow. And it'll soak that water up overnight. Tomorrow, I'll take and I'll coat everything with Tree Saver, which is a wood sealer, and it's a PVA base, not a wax base. So I'll seal all sides of these 3 bowls. I'll seal inside and outside of this bowl, and as this one starts to dry off, I'll put a second coat on the outside of this largest bowl. As I store these, I store them all together, and that's why I don't worry about coating a second coat on the inside, is because on the inside there's another set of bowls, and so there's not that much air movement. Once I get these all dried, then we'll remount them and cut the tenons off of them. I've just noticed I've left my chuck key in my chuck. That can be very dangerous depending on the lathe that you've got. I have an electronic variable speed lathe, so they don't start up at 100%. And I've also got my tool rest in the way to stop that so it couldn't develop the speed very quick. But a good safety protocol is if your chuck key is in your chuck, have your hand on it. And then take it out and set it to the side when you're done. I'm going to set this set of bowls to the side, and let's look at one that I've previously done and dried. Same type of wood. This is an olive ash, or an olive green ash. This one's been coated with Tree Saver. That's the green color that you see on it. And this piece is oval. So I measure lengthwise, I'm 14 inches. Probably the same size as what that other piece that we just did is. And I'm 13.5 this way. As I look at my tenon, same thing. I'm 5 inches this way. I'm 5 3/8 this way. I've still got the original center mark. I'm just going to place that bowl right up against the chuck jaws. Go into my center. Now this works because this bowl was laid out on an even grain surface. I've got the pith in the center, and so everything is moved fairly even. If you've got an offset pith, you may have to move your center. You can see quite a bit of movement. I'm 14 inches in diameter, so I already have done the math on this piece. I know 600 RPM should work for me. First thing I'm going to do is true up this tenon. I've got my nice shoulder cut, my dovetail with my spindle gouge. At worst case scenario, if this piece moves on the chuck and I lose center, I've already got my tenon sized in and ready to go. Shearing pill cut. Okay, one bit of caution here is with the sealer, the PVA sealer. The edges can, where it breaks off like that, and even while you're drying a piece, once that sealer has dried, those edges can get very sharp and they can cut you. So be very mindful of that, especially while this piece is rotating. So I've still got a little bit of sealer here. I'm out of it on the other side, so another cut, get up underneath there. I've still got a lot of wall thickness. You can see just a little bit of sealer left on that at the top. Seeing just a little gloss right at the top in the lights. That's bevel riding gloss, so that wasn't gloss from the sealer that time. I've got some torn surface up here. Rather than just take my best guess at getting, or this going into a chuck and shear scraping that, I'm going to try and get a little better surface off the tool. Slightly increase my speed. Tool with a fresh edge on it. 3/8 bowl gouge again. Same fingernail grind. And when I sharpened my tools this morning, because I'm doing large diameter work, I went to my 180 grit wheel. Felt better. Looks better. Yep, got that torn grain out. Few ridges in there. I can pick that up with a shear scrape when I turn this around. I can play all day trying to get that push cut right, but when I get into that, turn that around, shear scrape or a shear cut will serve me very well. This piece can now be set to the side. These interior pieces that don't have a center point or a tenon, I can take my best guess. Gonna size this for a smaller chuck. Standard set of jaws. Cut in my dovetail. This was a smaller diameter piece. I brought my speed up to about 1,000 RPM. This is a 10-inch diameter piece. And so I just barely brought it over sped on that. But that's how easy that is to do these once they've been dried. Now we'll just repeat that. Those same steps with the other two cores. Now that we've got this piece, let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of coring. Coring equipment takes some money, takes some horsepower. So be prepared for that. If you've got a larger machine, you're good to go with coring. One of the biggest advantages is the time savings. And I'm not talking about just the time savings that it takes to get the center of this removed with a bowl gouge. I'm talking about the fact that once I've got this out, I've got a whole nother blank. Even if I choose not to use the smaller pieces, I've got a good sized blank that I didn't have to spend time shaking hands with my chainsaw to get. Shaking hands with my chainsaw is not one of my more desirable things to do. I really appreciate nested sets and enjoy enjoy them. Now, what we did here today was a utilitarian set, green wood, solid rim, and I worked from the center out. I did the math from the outside in. Now, if I was doing a nested set of natural edge bowls, and I'm trying to get as many bowls out of that set as I might want to get, I would have started from the outside and taken the largest bowl, the cores out, and I wouldn't have left the room that I left in this one for the wood to warp and dry and move as it dried. Natural edge bowl, it's going to be look oval anyway, so the fact that it moves and dries oval, that's fine. But a natural edge, I can core out a natural edge just fine with these systems. Just about any species of wood can be cored. Some of your woods, though, that are a little bit more fibrous, will plug up the shavings a little bit quicker. You've got to be mindful of that. Some woods are a little bit more abrasive than others. They'll dull your cutters off quicker. Keep those cutters sharp. Dull cutters lead to catches. Also, green wood is much easier and much less dusty to core out than dry wood. So I chose a fresh cut piece of wood. This blank was cut out of the log yesterday. Remember to put a large tenon on your piece. Use as large as you can and still get the function out of the bowl. I like the larger jaws. If you don't have that capability, they do make a revolving center extension for your number 2 Morse taper, but I find it gets in the way of the knives themselves. So that's why I go to the larger set of jaws, and that is my preferred method, although it's not the only method. As with all coring systems, there is a learning curve. I gave you some tips and tricks along the way on how I do things, and the best tip I can give you is this one right here. Practice. It'll help you an awful lot. Don't let this get overwhelming. Have fun at it and enjoy it. Pretty soon you'll get your series of steps in line to where it works best for you in your shop.